Right, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to the Hallam Conference Centre. My name is Tony Adams and I'm the Vice Chair of the Black Members Council in the NUJ. The NUJ and its Black Members Council is proud to be hosting tonight's 20th year anniversary of the Claudia Jones Memorial Lecture, an event celebrated the life and work of the trailblazer that was Claudia Jones. Claudia Jones was a feminist, political activist, visionary and a pioneering journalist. Jones was born in Trinidad in 1915, and after living and working in the United States, where she was an active member of the American Communist Party, Jones was exiled to the UK in 1955. In the UK, Jones continued her lifelong fight against racial inequality and intolerance. She worked with activist organisations to campaign against housing injustices, discrimination in the workplace, and racist immigration policies. Jones was also a staunch champion for women's rights. She stressed, and this is a quote, "No peace can be obtained if any woman, especially those who are oppressed and impoverished, are left out of the conversation." Claudia Jones not only played a key role in fighting for racial equality in the UK, but she also helped to bring Caribbean culture in the forefront of British life. Tonight's Claudia Jones lecture is titled, "Who Let the Dogs Out? What Racism Tells Us About News Values and What the News Doesn't Tell Us About Black People." And hosting tonight's event is Alex Pascal, OBE. Well, what can I say about Alex? Alex is a British broadcaster, journalist, musician, composer, oral historian and educator, based in Britain for almost 5 decades, and he was one of the developers of the Notting Hill Carnival. He's a political campaigner and was part of the team behind the birth of Britain's first national black newspaper, The Voice, credited and having established a black presence in the British media. Alex is most notable as having been one of the first regular black radio voices in the UK, presenting the programme Black Londoners on BBC Radio London for 14 years from 1974. Initially, it was, I believe, only planned for a test series of 6 programmes. Black Londoners became, in 1978, the first black daily radio show in British history, with prominent guests from the worlds of politics, sport and literature. And I think, on that note, Alex, you played a key role, certainly in my broadcasting career. You were pivotal in that role. Which now also brings me to our guest speaker and NUJ Member of Honour, Mr. Gary Younge. Now, what can I say about Gary? Well, Gary, as we all know, is a British journalist, author, broadcaster and academic. In his final year of university, he was awarded a bursary from The Guardian to study journalism at City University. And after a short internship at Yorkshire Television, he joined The Guardian in 1993 and has since reported from all over the world, Europe, Africa and the US. And in November 2019, it was announced that Younge had been appointed as Professor of Sociology, I believe, at the University of Manchester. His book, just one to name, No Place Like Home, in which he retraced the roots of the civil rights freedom riders, was published in 1999 and was shortlisted for the Guardian First Book Award. So without any further delay, ladies and gentlemen and comrades, can I ask you to put your hands together for both Alex and Gary for tonight's NUJ 20th year memorial anniversary. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you, brother. Good evening, folk. How are you? Good evening. Fine. Just hearing my brothers speak says to me, but Alex, boy, you've been around a long time. I said to Jim before, we are the 2 dinosaurs of the Black Members Council. And I think I'm right. Because when I joined, it was Lionel Morrison, Jim Bomella as the 2 senior members. And we rallied together, but I have always been the rallier with Jim Bomella. And I think when we look at the history of the NUJ, the Black Members Council and others, no one can ever forget 2 people. The one who became the first on the NEC as a president, Lionel Morrison, from Africa. South, some people would say I say Africa. And the second, together with him, Jim Bomella, who has always been active in whatever we did, and he is the only one still doing it as he brings them. So it is important that we pay respect as we age, as we grow, as we explore. Because when I read a lot of things that people write, things I hear people say, I said, you read it second, third, or fourth hand. I'm first hand. I'm first hand. I joined the trade union movement in 1953 in Grenada. And when I met Jim and he says, have you been in the trade union movement before? I said, way, way, way back, and I didn't want to be in it. Because when the transport, where I started trade unionism, you could have done anything at that time that would take you upwards. But I was not interested in being a big figure in the trade union movement. I just wanted to be in the entertainment movement, because there you meet the big shakers. You really meet them. In my musical career, after leaving the transport in 1964, I worked at nightclubs and restaurants, mostly Italian restaurants. I'm very good with the Italians. I even change Spanish into English at times and then move it into Italian. I'm good at that. I could twist. On the ship that I was coming from the Caribbean, instead of giving me the third class, they gave me a first class room because I entertained on the ship from then right into Britain. I have been an entertainer playing African drums. I learned from the villages that I grew up in, and I have always said to people, excuse me, the drum is my antenna. Anywhere I hear sound, I come alive. On the ship's engine, I could hear it, and I come alive. And you know what I was good at, and I'm thanking myself I was good at it. If you take a picture of me, I said, can I have one? So I have pictures from then to now. Old things, little bits and pieces that people were throwing away, I kept them. So you can imagine the type of archive my wife and daughter and son has to curate at this time. And it would go on to even the black radio programs. Everything, and I'm going to bring that out, is dumped in skips at the back. And it is unusual to say this, but I'm saying it because Gary has some dogs that would go exploring to find out who let them out. Gary, you don't know what you have done with that title tonight that you chose. The extemporization of Calypsonians is stronger any time than the newspapers. What newspapers can't write, Calypsonians could talk about it. So you can imagine when these dogs find the scripts, what they're going to tell us. Jim and I, when my wife, I made a mistake, and I keep apologizing to her all the time. It was Joyce's concept of how to place the name of Claudia Jones into history. Because at the time that I was in love with this lady, we really and truly got together 1963, Seymour Hall. And in those days, I would fix with my friend to buy 2 tickets. And when you come, invite those 2 nurses and we're going to exchange a dance on the floor. Boy, what a time. So we danced in and we switched partners. And it was after, as a matter of fact, that she had and calling her from Mill Hill, where her friend gave me her number. When they got her and she came on the phone, she said, "Who gave you my number?" And she put the phone down on me. You could imagine the tabanka I was going through. And if you don't understand the tabanka in Trinidad, it means picong time. You could imagine how the heart was feeling. But we got together and got married. So maybe it was a good thing. And when she asked me, "What do you hope to become?" I said, "A poet." And she said to me, "Poets all die poor, living in anticipation." She is still with me. The greatest, most powerful, most supportive woman I have ever come across, who gave birth to my two children, our two children. One who lectures on business, music business, and the other one of the real producers of television programs that we gave an African name, Ayandele Alex Pascal. So I say that for all of you young people who are here, to realize that you may leave your country, or the country you live in may not see you as anything. But if you know where you want to go, you will get there. That's the river talking. And I moved on from transport to this, to that, to the other, into journalism. But before journalism, I was in Calypso. Man, you put anything down, I may not write the script as good as I could write a Calypso on it. So a lot of politicians who ain't see what I have yet, I have it. I've been writing from the day I hit the streets of London and keeping it in an archive. It's going to come out. It's time. I'm now 86 in a few days' time. And believe you me, I intend to keep going. Gary, you may be surprised that I didn't write what I'm saying here, because I have this thing about magnetism. When you reach a crowd as an entertainer, communicator, I've never been a broadcaster. I've always been a communicator. And that's what the BBC and I could not agree upon. Never been. Broadcasters at the BBC at that time sat down, read newspapers, and created what they wanted from the newspaper. No. Nothing second-hand for me. I go in out, my tape recorder, and I bought it, fine, and I bring in back what I wanted. So when you did that, you have it first-hand. Nobody could query what they said yesterday, although I noticed some people changing their mouth. Because I'm in my archives now, and I could read a lot of people changing them out of what they told me before. Be careful. Any of you who gave an interview, be very careful, because it will turn up one day if you start to tell lies. Be careful, young journalists. Whosoever you interview, document it properly, and you will be surprised what they thought was nothing yesterday. Gary would be able to tell you, as an eminent person now, who has gone into the media. He has gone across America. Where Claudia came from America, she came to Britain. Gary went across. He started in Britain, and he went across to America. And they like him there, That's what I like about it. They liked him there. But Gary ain't staying there at all. He said, money or no money are coming back where I'm born. You understand? Nice, Gary, because we need you here. And I realized I didn't know Gary or understand Gary. There was a time when I misunderstood Gary. I could talk to Gary now, very frank. Because I think as you age, as you grow older, you're able to say you made a mistake or something. Let's sit down, boy. Let's sit down and talk. Bring the rum. Hit the little thing. Let's have a little dinner. I could cook it. I'm a good cook. I ain't hiding that. My wife don't cook anymore because she can't smell or so. They threw down an X-ray machine on her head. And it's a big sort of situation, so I do the cooking. I like cooking. So I even write songs about my cooking. So when the title, Who Lets the Dogs Out, came, I said, whoa. You see, my father had 3 dogs. I grew up with 3 dogs, Butler, Lion, and Elsa. Butler was the one that came in the house, and he knew everything. You can't hide from a butler. Don't try it. Even the Queen knows that. Well, she knew that. And Prince Charles would too know that. Lion, boy, as soon as Elsa grumbled, Lion is out. He only have a big mouth. Elsa seldom barks. You just feel her teeth on your body. I like Elsa. Everybody was fearful of Elsa. So as we welcome, and I want you to give this man a giant round of applause. Gary Younge, you are lovely. We depend upon you. Your writing has upset certain people. You stay there. That was Claudia all told. And the generation of people of us who came around her realized she was a beautiful, lovely person. I saw, if I was older, I might have challenged this lady to marry her. She was a really warm, well-dressed, highly well-spoken, well-educated woman. And I'm waiting on one of you young journalist women to show me. I haven't seen you yet, because as they rise, you see, blackheads are funny. They come last on the face. They come last on the face, but they're fast to go out. I've learned that. I've watched some of them who were very prominent on the BBC, and they're gone. You know who I'm talking about. So Gary, I know you've got the bark, but what I don't know, and I think you and all is trying to find out, who let the dogs out. Give a big round of applause.
Well, what an introduction that was. We were in for a night. So I'm going to tell you a story about being in Oakland, visiting a friend in Oakland. And this friend said, I have to go see another friend, you come with me. So I went with her to see this other friend. And this other friend had her mother there. Her mother would have been then about 89, 90. So he was spring chicken compared to And I was talking to my friend and her friend. I wasn't really, obviously I was being polite, but beyond that, I hadn't really engaged with the older lady. And somehow the conversation got onto the Berlin Wall or, something about what was happening. Could have been the Iraq War. And then this older lady who hadn't said anything for the whole time said, I don't care what people say, I'll always be a communist. And I was like, oh, hello. Hello, who are you? And her name's Dorothy Burnham. Dorothy, who's still alive, she's 106 at the moment, was a friend of Claudia. Her second child was called Claudia, and they had lots of Claudia stories from when Claudia was in Brooklyn, before she was expelled from America and arrived here. And one of the things that I didn't fully twig about Claudia until I met Dorothy was how young she was when she died. That she was 49, I think. And And that made me think of a quote. I interviewed John Carlos, who's one of the two Olympians who raised their fist in the '68 Olympics. And John Carlos said to me, talking about himself, not Claudia obviously, in life, there's the beginning and the end. And the end doesn't matter, and the beginning doesn't matter. All that matters is what you do in between. Whether you're prepared to do what it takes to make change. There has to be physical and material sacrifice. When all the dust settles and we're getting ready to play down for the 9th inning, baseball term, the greatest reward is to know that you did your job when you were here on the planet. And Claudia did her job. And it behoves me in this lecture to talk a little bit about what that job was, which beyond everything else, the resistance following the Notting Hill pogroms, effectively, the setting up of the West Indian Gazette, was to make space. Was to make space so that people like me, whose name she never knew, obviously, because she was dead before I was born, could come through to make space. And this is what Alex and Jim and many people whose names we don't know have done as people made space for Claudia, actually. And that's an important thing to remember, because people like to think that they get where they get because of an act of genius, of their hard work and all of that. And it's not that none of that is relevant, but lots of people work hard and they don't get on. And lots of people before worked hard and couldn't get on. And so there has to be an understanding in a time when there are more opportunities now for black journalists than there ever has been, of a responsibility to keep that space open and to make more space. Because you wouldn't be here, none of us would be here without that space. Now, obviously, that is not just a responsibility of black people, but it is a responsibility. And I've always been grateful for the way that the NUJ Black Members Council, where every month is Black History Month. It's November the 14th, and here we are doing the Claudia Jones lecture. Every month is Black History Month here. The way that the Black Members Council have fulfilled that task. And there are a series of baton changes, of generational baton changes that have to happen to make sure that nobody thinks that the little that we have is sufficient. And this, in a way, is what I want to address in this talk. So our understanding of what constitutes news is supposed to be self-explanatory. The most widely known aphorism, and it's not entirely sure where it comes from, and of course, it's horribly gendered, but it's when a dog bites a man, that's not news, because it happens so often. But if a man bites a dog, now that is news. But over the few years that I have been working in this profession, I wondered if there might not be an addendum to that adage, a qualifying footnote to what seems like the obvious, because sometimes events derive their potential news value precisely because they happen so often. That there are things that happen with such regularity and predictability that journalists have simply ceased to recognize their news value. Not least if the things that happen are least likely to happen to the people who are most likely to be journalists. That much of what we've come to accept as commonplace has dulled our curiosity to why so much of what is commonplace is unacceptable. The given the prevailing and escalating inequalities and inequities, we simply do not occupy as journalists all too often the worlds that we pretend to cover. That there is value at times in asking, why do dogs keep biting people? Who owns these dogs? And why do the same people keep getting bitten? Now, I want to illustrate that tonight at some length with examples from a book I wrote in 2016 called Another Day in the Death of America, and a series that I was part of The Guardian in 2017 called Beyond the Blade. The book is premised on the fact, when I wrote it, that every day, on average, 7 children or teens in America are shot dead. That number now is about 12, by the way, every day. And so I picked a day at random, November the 23rd, 2013, and then set out over the next 2 years to find who these kids were, seeking out everyone who knew them, from their parents, pastors, basketball coaches, anyone. 10 kids were shot dead that day across the country. The youngest was 9. The eldest was just a few days shy of his 20th birthday. The series, Beyond the Blade, set out to cover a similar cohort but a different tragedy. All the children and teens killed by knives, mapping the number of children who were killed and also the themes that emerged. Now, being a journalist, I wanted to start with the facts, or rather the things that we think we know. In her biography of Harlem Renaissance writer Zora Neale Hurston, Valerie Boyd explained why it was so difficult to track Hurston's whereabouts during her early 20s. Boyd writes, in 1911, it was relatively easy for someone, particularly a black woman, to evade history's recording gaze. If not legally linked to a man as daughter or wife, black women did not count in some ways, at least to the people who did the official counting. So the question of who counts and whom is counted is not simply a matter of numbers. It's about power. Collecting information, particularly about people, demands both the authority to gather the data and the capacity to keep and transmit it. And those who have both the authority and the capacity need to feel that those they are keeping tabs on matter. In the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, which I covered, as the dead floated in the street and the living were stranded on highways and rooftops, a huge crowd of mostly black and poor people descended on the city's convention center. When asked why relief organizations have been caught off guard, the hapless and hopeless director of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, Michael Brown, said, "We're seeing people that we didn't know existed." Never had a truer word been said. The growing political and economic inequalities, both within nations and between them, is not only replicated in journalism, but it is increasingly being amplified by it. A report by the Sutton Trust and Social Mobility Commission in Britain just a few years ago revealed that there's a higher proportion of Oxbridge graduates who are writing columns than sitting in the House of Lords. And the upshot is an elite consensus episodically shattered by the intrusion of more democratic forms of new technology, but never ultimately displaced. In short, not everybody counts, and therefore not everybody is counted. We know how many US police officers are killed in the line of duty in any given year. But there was no national tally for how many people were killed by police officers. And it was revealing when they started to do that tally that they realized that there hadn't actually been an increase in the number of black people being killed by the US police. What there had been was a growing political awareness that this reality had existed for several years. So these shootings weren't news in the conventional sense. There was nothing new. It was actually the same as every other year. They were neither rare nor to the communities involved particularly surprising. They were news only because the people that make the news, journalists, could no longer ignore them. Because, as was the case with Trayvon Martin, Facebook and Twitter smelled a rat before journalists could. The world, in that respect, didn't change. What changed was journalists' ability to pass off the grotesque as unremarkable. And when it came to knife crime, it turned out the facts were also very elusive. Crimes committed with knives are not new. Shakespeare's plays are full of them. Knife crime as a phenomenon, however, is relatively recent. We did a survey of the national press and the London Evening Standard. In the year 2000, there was just one mention of the term knife crime. 3 years later, it was up to 24. Coverage peaked in 2008 with 2,602. before trending precipitously downwards. The survey also revealed that the only time the term knife crime was used in those papers was in relation to black boys being killed in London. But staggeringly, given the amount of column inches devoted to that issue, national data on the number of children and teens killed by knives in any given year was not publicly available when we did the survey, when we did the series. When we contacted the Home Office, they told you that individual police forces collected information. They told you to try the Office for National Statistics. They told you that all the deaths in England and Wales are collated in the homicide index, is retained by the Home Office. So they sent you to the Home Office, and then the Home Office sent you back to the ONS. But our data team got there eventually. And what we discovered once the figures were released for the first time was that while black kids are overrepresented among the knife fatalities, the overwhelming majority of kids killed by knives up until then in Britain weren't black. They are in London, but outside London, they didn't even constitute 1 in 5. So while knife crime, particularly as it affects young people, has been the subject of national debate for a decade, our awareness of its true scale is limited, our grasp of its trajectory is only approximate, and coverage of it is erratic. In short, as a nation, we are conscious that there is something out there known as knife crime. But as yet, we lack any coherent or enduring national response, and instead have fallen back on flawed assumptions underpinned by prejudice, ignorance, and political expediency. In his landmark book, Public Opinion, Walter Lippmann wrote, "The only feeling that anyone can have about an event that they do not experience is the feeling aroused by their mental image of that event." And that is why, until we know what others think they know, we cannot truly understand their acts. Our opinions cover a bigger space, a longer reach of time, a greater number of things than we can directly observe. They have, therefore, to be pieced together out of what others have reported. The trouble is that what others report is neither neutral nor consistent. Patrick Green, the manager of the Ben Kinsella Trust in London, named after a 16-year-old boy who was stabbed to death in Islington, told me the media's response to the murder of young people is very inconsistent. Some of these tragic deaths get little or no coverage. These stories are often lost because it's a busy news day or because they consider the young person to be an unworthy victim. The media are more likely to report on a murder when it's a bright, educated young person from a privileged background. And we all think, how did this happen to them? But we don't hear about or ask the same questions about the murders of young people from more vulnerable backgrounds. And in the absence of facts, prejudice and presumption move in. One thing that became rapidly clear when we were doing this series is that knife crime is a construct. It doesn't simply mean, as one might reasonably expect, crimes committed with knives. It denotes a certain type of crime committed by a certain type of criminal in a certain kind of context. As it relates to young people, this construct comprises several elements. The children who commit the crimes are evil, described variously as naturally violent. I'm not going to do all the air quotes, you're just going to have to imagine them. Monsters and teenage thugs who populate a section of society that is, quote, feral, callous, and bloodthirsty. It's also racialized. In 2007, then Prime Minister Tony Blair told an audience in Cardiff, the black community, the vast majority of whom in these communities are decent, law-abiding people, thank you, Tony, are horrified at what is happening. But they need to be mobilized in denunciation of this gang culture that is killing innocent young black kids. But we won't stop this by pretending it isn't young black kids doing it. This with no facts. I know there were no facts because I looked for the facts and I was told there were no facts. A year earlier, David Cameron, then the opposition leader, suggested in a speech that hip-hop, which I'm sure he knows a lot about, was partly responsible for youth violence. I would say to Radio 1, which I'm sure he listens to regularly, do you realise that some of the stuff you play on Saturday nights encourages people to carry guns and knives, he said. This resonates beyond politicians. On social media, when white kids are killed, people opine about the state of youth today, the demise of the town in which they died, or the world in general. But when black kids are killed, usually the assumption is that their race had something to do with it. One of the first young people to be killed by a knife in 2017 was a boy called Jojo Nsaka. He was 19, fatally stabbed in the shadow of Wembley Stadium. According to his friends, Jojo, a business studies student at Middlesex University, planned to open his own business selling baseball caps with his own design and dreamed of one day becoming a millionaire. He worked 2 jobs, JD Sports in the week, Tesco at the weekends, in order to support his family, including his 2-year-old daughter, and to pay his tuition fees. Just a month before, he'd bought Christmas dinner for the whole family. And yet a few days after his death, a Conservative councillor from Dover, Bob Frost, posted a news story about Jojo's murder on Twitter with the message, "Black Lives Matter. The carnage continues. Any protest from the community? Thought not." It's also understood to be primarily urban and gendered. Now, some of these preconceptions bear some relationship to reality and some don't. None hold completely. Of the 32 children and teens that were killed by knives the year that we did the series, more than a third were outside London, just under a third were white, 20% were rural or suburban, 10% were female, 10% were age 5 or under. The point is, they are preconceptions based on anecdote, and they bear the full weight of the prejudice and presumption that I mentioned earlier. So much so that the first 10 kids to be stabbed to death that year, the only stories in which the term knife crime were used was in the national press were related to Jojo and another boy, Kwamari Serunkuma Barnes. A 15-year-old boy stabbed not too far from Jojo died outside his school. They also happened to be the only 2 black boys and the only 2 Londoners who were killed at that stage. So, some things aren't counted, and some people don't count, and even when they do count, they don't necessarily count for much. And this became clear when reporting on gun deaths in America. One of the boys who died on the day I was covering the book was Samuel Brightman, a 16-year-old kid shot dead in South Dallas while walking down the street with his friend. Under the headline, "Teen Fatally Shot While Walking Down the Street." It's a great headline. The Dallas Morning News wrote a single paragraph. They didn't have an awful lot to go on. In the days to come, there was no profile, no testimony from his school friends or teachers, no sense of who he was, let alone why he was killed. A young man was removed from the planet and just got a paragraph. How can that be? So I went to find out. And it turned out that Samuel Cordray Brightman, known to his family as Day Day, was a sweet-tempered, fragile young man, a homebody, whose best friend was his younger sister, Whitney, who often as not fought his battles for him. He was just coming out of his shell. He'd recently been elected vice president of his school council. The women in his extended family described him alternatively as the son they'd never had or the son they wished they'd had. Such was the short life whose death received such short shrift in the Dallas media. I spoke to the reporter who'd written the paragraph. Now, to be fair, it was only her task to record it, not to follow it up. So when the day was done, she hands the stories over to the regular crime team, which would take up the weekend stories they think are worth running with, and Samuel's death didn't make the cut. But that didn't surprise her. Indeed, it would surprise very few. The area where Samuel was shot is poor and black and on the south side of Dallas. It's called Pleasant Grove, but it's disparagingly known as Unpleasant Grove. And shootings, she said, were common there. People are desensitized to it. They reason that that's where bad things happen. And I would hear this refrain often when talking to journalists who covered that day's shootings. Clearly, I was the only person who had called them to follow up on the story. They'd kindly rifle through their notes, tell me what they knew, and if they'd been to the crime scene, what they'd see. Invariably, when I asked if they had any contact details for family members I could speak to, or if there'd been any developments in the investigation, they would explain somewhat matter-of-factly why they had moved on. Unfortunately, homicides are not uncommon in that area, said one. Unless something unexpected happened, it just wouldn't be the kind of story we'd follow up on, said another. Now, to some extent, I understand this as a journalist. I have no idea what happened to Jesus Joseph, an 8-year-old Haitian boy whom I met in the Dominican Republic in 2005, who turned up at a refugee center with his neck twisted from carrying heavy loads and his shoulders bearing welts from the mistreatment of a family who'd bought him and used him as a domestic slave. I don't know what happened to Kulo Korban, whom I met in Sierra Leone in 1998, who had both his ears and 3 fingers amputated by rebels in the conflict there. After a week reporting from both places, I moved on. And I write this with neither pride nor guilt. There is a level of detachment inherent and arguably necessary in a profession. Without it, you would become emotionally depleted. Moreover, one is constantly gauging what more there is to say and who would be listening if you said it. Outlets have limited resources. Editors have to justify budgets for keeping you in a certain place or sending you back to trace each individual story, which in turn must be balanced against what other news stories you might be missing. Journalism is not social work, and even social workers, to be effective, must move on. But having said all that, I still understand that these are little more than rationalizations for how I and other journalists exercise our relative power. We choose whose stories are told, whom we go back to, and where these resources are deployed. And those choices are not objective. They are made on the basis of what stories we subjectively consider are worthy of being told at any given time. The fact that most media outlets are commercial enterprises is, of course, a factor. The more a story costs, the less likely it is to bring in readers, the less likely institutions are to invest resources in it. But it's not the only factor, and generally I'm not convinced it's the most important factor. To no small extent, what the media does is replicate and transmit the inequalities that exist elsewhere. Journalists are more likely on both sides of the Atlantic to be white, wealthy and educated than the population at large. And that means they're less likely to live in the areas where gun deaths and knife deaths happen, and less likely to know the people whom they happen to. Journalistically, this remoteness comes at a severe price. They literally don't know the people they are writing about. In Ways of Seeing, John Berger wrote, "The way we see things is affected by what we know and what we believe. And the relation between what we see and what we know is never settled. What's truly unsettling is that when some people see that a black kid has been shot or stabbed, they are far more comfortable blaming the kid, his family and his community, their family and their community, than the society that allows either guns to circulate so freely or neighborhoods to decline so completely. And some of those people are journalists. It was intriguing to me how many people, when I told them about my book project, immediately wanted to know how many of the deaths were gang-related, as though that might provide some acceptable context in which a child or teen was shot. Victims become divided into the deserving and the undeserving. The first comment following the short online story of Samuel's death came from Marge Vargas, who wrote, "I have 2 adult kiddos and there's no way they would have been out walking the streets after dark, and I always know where they are. I do not blame the victims, but all parents could do better." So a mother just lost her child, and this was Marge Vargas's contribution to the discussion. There's no empathy there. The assumption is simply that this could not happen to her because she is a better parent. But I found his family, and the fact, and they weren't difficult to find. And the fact was that Samuel was accompanying his friend, Denzel, on the 10-minute walk back to Denzel's granny's house after a family night, drinking cocoa, playing Uno, and watching We're the Millers with his mum, friend, Denzel, and sister. His mother, a loving and attentive parent, knew exactly where he was. She just couldn't save him. The worst thing that Samuel did that night was cheat at Uno. But this is how we've come to a stage in America, certainly, where black parents have to make the case for why their unarmed children should not have been shot. And this is where the distance and challenge of empathy comes in. Because the further you are from living in a community where a child might be murdered in such a way, the less likely you are to see it as a priority, its victims as newsworthy, or solutions as possible. Put bluntly, a child being killed is a far more newsworthy event for those who know the child than for those who don't and are never likely to. So news values aren't an objective account of the most important things that happen in any given time and place. They are the sum total of the priorities and received wisdom of those who provide the news. And those who provide the news are not a representative group. Now, what I'm not saying here, and I cannot emphasize this enough, is that the rich should not be able to write about the poor, or white people should not be able to write about black, or men should not be able to write about women, or any of that. That way madness lies. We should never underestimate the capacity to empathize, analyze, and engage beyond one's own immediate experience. What I am saying is that this recognizes the distance between subject and object. The distance a journalist or organization will need to travel to remain both relevant, competent, and respected. What I am saying is that in the absence of diverse newsrooms, and I mean diversity in all spheres, not just race, but class and gender and sexual orientation and ability and so on, these problems become more acute. That the point of having a critical mass of a range of different classes, ethnicities, religions, regions, and gender balance in your newsroom isn't to make you feel good. It's not so that you can look different and yet act the same. That might provide photo opportunities, but not equal opportunities. That, in the words of Angela Davis, is the model of diversity that is the difference that brings no difference and the change that brings no change. The point is that with that diversity, it would enable news organizations to do their jobs better. And in doing their jobs better, they would find richer, more meaningful stories. Samuel's family weren't hard to find, it's just nobody bothered to try. Turns out his mum, Audrey, was working for a firm that provided home help when her boss was indicted for Medicaid fraud. The lawyer said she had to leave the job or she would be indicted too. She took the opportunity to get a operation. While she was healing, she was rear-ended on the freeway by someone who didn't have insurance. Left her with a deranged knee. She couldn't walk. She couldn't work. Her unemployment benefits ran out. Within 2 months, she was evicted from her apartment. She moved in with her sister, 2 adults and 4 kids in a 2-bedroom house. She had been living in quite a nice suburb. But that couldn't last long, and so she moved to Pleasant Grove, which was the one place that would take her with her shot credit. And that's the place where black kids being shot isn't news. Now, there was a story here for anyone who wanted it about the precariousness of middle class living in America, where 1 in 3 either live in poverty or struggle in the category that the census terms the near poor, 1 accident away from poverty. The descent from comfort to penury in America is precipitous and round every corner. It was a story hidden in plain sight. It just needed someone to take the blinkers off to see it and unshackle themselves from the assumptions to pursue it. This, I believe, is less the product of malign neglect in journalism than the unconscious omissions born from the dead weight of power and privilege that makes the poor and dark in America and elsewhere invisible. In short, there are places in almost every American city where children and teens are expected to get shot. Areas where the deaths of young people by gunfire doesn't contradict a city's general understanding of how the world should work, but confirms it. To raise children there, whether they are involved in criminal activity or not, is to incorporate those odds into your daily life. Now, just as Samuel's story revealed America's blind spots, so the story of the fatal stabbing of Kwamari Serunkuma Barnes in Willesden revealed many of ours. Kwamari, who was 15, was killed on January the 23rd, 2017, outside his school. He looked younger than his 15 years, but by most accounts, he was an old soul. He sang Wailers tunes like other kids might sing nursery rhymes. He could cook a full roast dinner for the family. In 2015, he stayed up all night for the general election, matching the results against expectations. This was the boy who was singing to himself as he left school that day, only to be chased by another 15-year-old boy. He ran screaming for help and shouting, "I'm going to get stabbed." And later that evening, his short life ended when one of the 3 stab wounds pierced a lung. His death was front-page news in the Evening Standard for 2 days running and received cursory coverage elsewhere in the country. The trial of his assailant came some 5 months later, starting just after the 2017 election. The tragedy at Grenfell had happened shortly afterwards, so there was a lot going on. Nonetheless, given the initial interest in the death, I imagined that there would be considerable interest in what came of it. But it turned out that for most of the trial, only myself and a film crew doing a longer documentary about murders in general were there. On the day of the verdict, there was just me and a court reporter. Writing the article and watching the 15-year-old in the dock that day, I wrote, "It's difficult to know what justice looks like when one 15-year-old is dead and another is on trial for their murder. Naturally, you want the perpetrator to be punished. But if the perpetrator is also a child, then on one level, it seems as if some broader, deeper, more intractable injustice has already been committed. One thrashes about, mostly in vain, for an institution, a service or agency to blame, for an intervention that could have helped, or a moral safety net with smaller holes that might have caught him. There are preferable outcomes, but there are no good outcomes. If the accused is not found guilty, then the killer is still out there, or he just got away with it. If he is guilty, then one child is still dead and the other's life is ruined." A few months later, after the accused had been convicted and then confessed, I managed to reach the mother of the boy who had killed Kumari. I felt this was important because for the most part, knife crime is reduced to a crude morality play in which the young perpetrators are all but invisible. Abstracted from parents or community, we meet them in the dock defined by their crime. They are not children who have killed, but killers. Not people who have done something monstrous, but monsters. They stand reduced to this one act. They killed a child. And their anonymity protected by law, we don't see their pictures or hear from their parents. By the time the trial is over, we have no idea where they've come from, why or how, only where they're going. Prison. Without face, family or friend, they are not children, but they are cautionary tales. But in order to heed the caution in these tragic crimes, we must first restore the humanity of those who commit them. Failing to do so is not only morally problematic, it is counterproductive. The best chance we have of sparing the next child from an early death is finding out why the last one died. There are lots of lessons, but none can be learned if they do not start from the fact that the murder was committed by a boy, not a metaphor. When I found his mum, I discovered that the boy who killed Kumari had been a happy kid who graduated as a toddler from Finding Nemo to Lion King, deciding early on that he wanted to be a vet. Very active child. In later years, he became an accomplished athlete and footballer. But while in primary school, his dad was deported. That was the first time his mum noticed him getting angry and withdrawn. She tried to get help from child and adolescent mental health services at the time, but was told he didn't meet the threshold. At secondary school, he seemed to be doing well academically, but before long, he was expelled after a physical altercation with a teacher, and from there, he was sent to a pupil referral unit. It soon became clear that the search for some broader injustice that might shed light on Kumari's death would not actually have been in vain. Indeed, his mother could document in painstaking detail requests for help that either were not answered, were not met, or where the response was inadequate, even as she warned of the possible consequences. 23rd of March 2015, she sent an email to her MP with the heading, "Please help me save my son." She described how the behaviour of her then 13-year-old child was deteriorating rapidly, involving himself with the wrong crowd, and her fears for the impact it could have on his siblings. She detailed how she had enrolled herself in parenting classes, consulted with social workers and psychologists, sought referrals for mental health assessments, requested to move him from his school, asked for help to move her family out of London, but felt she was getting nowhere. She ended the email, "All I want is for my child not to become another statistic and would like all the help possible to stop this from happening." A few months later, she warned a meeting of social workers in Brent if we don't do something, either he's going to end up dead or someone's going to end up in a body bag. She tried. We don't know if that murder could have been prevented, but we know that not everything was tried. At the bottom of many responses from Brent Council to these emails that she showed me was the very impersonal sign-off. Brent Council needs to save 54 million over the next 2 years. Find out about our budget consultation events and have your say. There is a structural context to these deaths that is willfully ignored and which is about to be ramped up once again. We must, of course, talk about personal responsibility. But there is also collective responsibility, particularly when it comes to children and youth. They are a protected category. As a society, there is a general view that we have a societal responsibility for children. And the fact is that as a society, we have been reneging on that responsibility. The swinging austerity cuts that scrap the education maintenance allowance, that has defunded education for 16 to 19-year-olds, that has gutted youth services, and a starved NHS which is unable to adequately provide mental health assistance to the young. Once the government made the political choices that effectively produce a crisis, it then expects the police to establish order and calm over the instability. Police say that young people who are carrying knives increasingly do so not through gang affiliation, but for protection. Youth workers say that the kids are scared and don't trust the police to protect them. In short, as a nation, we are actively and consciously underfunding our children. And these cuts fall more heavily on the poor, and since the dark are more likely to be poor, on those who are black or brown. A very crude way of saying this is that austerity kills. And we're about to go through another round. These deaths are too often understood as a crisis of culture and crime, of drill and grime, while the economic and political decisions that help create the context for them go unchallenged. In the event that the media wants to cover these stories, they hone in on the boy in the dock and the boy in the body bag, but they don't seem to be very interested in how they got there or what might be done to prevent others destined for the same fate. Few would make the claim that there is a direct, seamless, causal link between austerity and the rise in violent crime. But nor could anyone reasonably claim that if you cut access to mental health care, if you cut youth services, if you cut education provision, if you cut access to libraries, if you do all that to young people and you underpay their parents and you make cuts to universal credit, that's not going to have an effect on how they behave. And as the cuts go deeper, leaving vulnerable people more desperate, the contextual connection is compelling. If you make it harder for them to stay in education, harder for them to get treatment if they have mental, psychological challenges, harder to find safe and productive places to spend leisure time, what do you think is going to happen? As the boy's mother put it, is he responsible for his actions? Yes. Did I try everything I could? Yes. Were we failed? Yes. The shock over Grenfell or Hurricane Katrina or the Black Lives Matter demonstrations or the 2011 riots illustrates how the media episodically discovers the daily reality of black people in much the same way that teenagers discover sex. Urgently, earnestly, voraciously, and carelessly, with great self-indulgence but precious little self-awareness. They've always been aware of it, but somehow when confronted with it, it nonetheless takes them by surprise. And for journalists then, the surprise becomes the news. Crikey, look what I found, rather than the news itself. Goodness, look what's been going on while I've been looking elsewhere. When the suburb of Ferguson, Missouri went up in flames, to almost universal condemnation in the media about the flames, not about the murder of Michael Brown, the Department of Justice in America conducted a report into how the city was being run. It's a report that I believe any enterprising journalist could have produced themselves if they hadn't become inured to the kind of systemic discrimination that had been taking place. Among other things, the DOJ, Department of Justice, found that between 2007 to 2014, one woman was arrested twice, spent 6 days in jail, and paid $550 as a result of one instance of illegal parking. 7 years after the original infraction, she still owed $541. And that was how Ferguson raised his revenue. It was not a glitch in the system, it was the system. And then there was a 14-year-old boy found in the abandoned building who was chased down by a dog which bit his ankle and his left arm as he protected his face. The boy says officers kicked him in the head and then laughed about it afterwards. Officers say he was armed, or they thought he was armed, but he wasn't. When the DOJ investigated, they found that every time a police dog bit someone in Ferguson, that person was black. And so it turns out that sometimes dog bites man really is the story. It's just that journalists keep missing it. Thank you.